Well, good morning. How are we doing this morning? It is good to see you all. We are in our last week of a series called Unplanned, where we've just been looking at stories in the New Testament that did not seem to be a planned out event. Jesus was just going somewhere, he was doing something, and someone came to him, or people weren't expecting to receive a plan, and they did. And so we're going to finish that up today. And really, the purpose of this has been to open our eyes to our day-to-day life. Like for us to not, if you're a follower of Jesus, always be looking for that booming voice from God or that burning bush to tell you to do something, but to open our eyes as we go about our day, that if you're a follower of Jesus, the Holy Spirit is with you and will use many opportunities to teach us as we go from moment to moment. It doesn't have to be a special setting or special place. And today we're going to finish this series. We're going to talk about a man that maybe you've heard, a man who had an unplanned interaction with Jesus. In fact, it may be the most famous unplanned interaction in the Gospels. And it's maybe one of the greatest because of the outcome of this unplanned experience. The first ones we looked at were kind of sad. The men left not listening to Jesus. They went away sad because they didn't want to change who they were. They didn't want to give up some things in their life. But today the outcome is a huge outcome. And it's important not just because it ends good, but also because the outcome that happens in this man's life is one that we need in our life as well. And so this is true if you are a follower of Jesus, or if you're just checking Jesus out and church out and you've still got questions. In either case, the outcome that happens in this story is one that we need in our life. The problem is he deals with something that we need to deal with, but we often don't do it. We often let this go even though we need to deal with it. Have you ever had something in your life you need to deal with, right? There's small things that you need to deal with. Usually in the winter, your tire pressure light comes on and you think, oh, I should fill that up, But now at this point, you're like, summer's almost here. Those tires are going to heat up. I don't need to fill it up. They'll be okay, right? You just don't deal with it. Or the house projects, and I'm not talking about refinishing the basement. I'm talking about, the kids chipping paint in the house, around the house, and you're like, I need to deal with that, but you just keep putting it off. You choose not to look at that wall when you walk down the hallway. One day, the next owner of the house can touch up that paint. You choose not to deal with it. And then there's other ones, there's bigger things. If you've got kids, you know this. Maybe your kids are fighting. They're, he's hitting me, she's hitting me. And there's probably a lesson for you to teach them in that moment, something for you to deal with. But it's the end of spring break, so you just go sit on the front porch and just think, I'm just not dealing with it right now, right? You just put it off, you just ignore it. Or maybe there's a situation at work or with your spouse. Maybe there's a family situation, a health issue that you should deal with. We've all had these, and we ignore them, we push them down, we push them away, we don't handle it. And so in the back of our minds, in the depths of our heart, it lingers. It is there. It may not be present every day, but there are things that cause it to come back up and make us think about it and wrestle with it and deal with it. That's what we're going to talk about today. We know the things in our lives, even if other people don't, that we ignore, that we put off. And this is true about what we're going to read about today. Not to bring up your past, but this is how we treat our past. Most of us are not good at dealing with our past. We push it off, we push it to the side, but we all have a past. All of us, everyone in this room has made poor decisions. We have made mistakes. We have said the wrong thing. We have sinned against someone. We have sinned against God. We have pursued the wrong endeavor. And often we don't deal with it. We just move on and it lingers. And maybe more accurately, we never accept the way that Jesus would deal with our past. Because this is true about everyone in this room. We all have parts of our past that we wish we didn't have. Right? Now, I'm not going to make you shout those out right now. That would be embarrassing for all of us. I'm not going to tell you mine, okay? Don't come up after and say, hey, what's yours, Pastor? I'm not going to tell you. But we all have parts of our past that we wish we didn't have. Things that bring us shame. Now, this is not a lesson in shame. Okay, this is not to beat anyone down. This is a lesson in how to deal with our past, to deal with our mistakes, to deal with our sin, to deal with the poor choices that we have made. Instead of pushing them down and ignoring them and allowing Satan to call them back to mind and bring them back to our life from time to time. And more importantly, it's in a story of how Jesus deals with the past that we wish we didn't have. So we're going to be in Luke chapter 19 today. I hope you have a Bible with you. If you don't have one with you, there's some out in our lobby, and those are our gifts to you. It'll be on the screen as well. But we're going to be in Luke chapter 9, and Luke is a man who is a physician. He was hired by a wealthy man to research Jesus. This wealthy man said, hey, I've heard a lot about Jesus. He possibly had even seen him, and he wanted to know the life of Jesus. He wanted to know what is true and what isn't true. And so he hired Luke, who was an educated person, and Luke did some discovery. He did some research, and he writes this letter, this gospel, Luke, after all the research and the eyewitnesses and the people he talked to. This is the story that he comes up with about Jesus' life. And this is a story that maybe you've heard 100 times if you've gone to church. Maybe you've never heard it. But my hope for you would be that if you have heard it 100 times or never heard it, you would listen to it with new ears, because I believe there's a truth found in this story, that there's lots of truths, but there's one that we often miss, and it's maybe the most important one. It's a principle, it's a truth for us that gives us freedom that often we live without. Freedom from our past, freedom that allows us to stop being held back by sin and shame. And so I think it'll help give us the life that God intends for us to have. So let's check it out. Luke 19, verse 1 and 2 says this: He entered Jericho. He's talking about Jesus. And was passing through. So he's going through. He's not scheduled a meeting. He doesn't have an appointment. Nothing's on his calendar. He's heading to something else. This was unplanned. And there was a man named Zacchaeus, who was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. Now, this is a really important statement in this story. We have to understand this. He was the chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. If we had been around in that day, this phrase would have meant a lot to us. It doesn't mean that much to us today. If you've been here before, you've heard us talk about this. But just in case you haven't, I want you to understand the importance of who Zacchaeus was. As the chief tax collector, he was viewed as the lowest person in that society. He was hated by everyone in the Jewish community. And the reason he was hated by them is because the Jews viewed tax collectors as people who had betrayed them, people who had turned their backs on the Jews, because these tax collectors were collecting taxes from Rome. And so Jewish people hated them. They're like, hey, you're supposed to be one of us, and you're taking money out of our pockets to give to Rome. And so the tax collectors were absolutely despised. And they had no oversight as long as Rome got the taxes that they required. And so it would work like this. As the chief tax collector, he would have other tax collectors who worked for him throughout the region. And so Rome would go to the chief tax collector and say, we demand $10 per person in your region. That's the tax that needs to be paid to Rome. And so the chief tax collector would gather his tax collectors up, and he would say, hey, here's how much you have to bring me per person in Rome, $15. You see where this is going? If you're worried about the government today, the government's always been corrupt, okay? It's just how it works. God's still in control. And so he would say, I need $15. And then those tax collectors would go out. And guess what? They would come knock on your door and ask for? $20, right? And so they would pocket some money, and then he would pocket some money, and then he would send the $10 back to Rome. And so he was absolutely hated. He was hated by the Romans because he wasn't a Roman citizen. He was hated by the Jews because they knew he was robbing them. He had no place. He was hated everywhere he went. He was getting rich at the expense of his own people. In fact, they hated him so much that when you read the New Testament, people would often come talk to Jesus or to the disciples, and they would categorize people in these two categories. They would say, you're spending time with the sinners and the tax collectors, right? So the sinners, they were like, we can't even call him a sinner. Everybody else, everybody else who's committed sin in their life, we're going to lump them in this category of sinner. But the tax collector is even worse. We're not even going to call them sinner. That's too good for them. It's the sinners and the tax collectors. And so all of these people hated them. It's a guy with no friends at all, not on the Roman side, not on the Jewish side. And he hears that Jesus is coming down the road, passing through. There's apparently a large crowd, and he wants to see who he is. So look in verse 3. It says he was trying to see who Jesus was, but he was not able to because of the crowd. And since he was a short man, so running ahead, he climbed up a sycamore tree to see Jesus, since he was about to pass that way. So this is a guy everybody knows. He's well known because he collects money, and he's kind of making a fool of himself. In that time, for a man to run somewhere, much less climb a tree, people would turn and look at you and think, what are you doing? Like, this is undignified. This is beneath you. And yet, that's what he does. He goes and climbs this tree. He doesn't have an appointment with Jesus. He's not expecting to talk to Jesus. It says he just wanted to see him. He's heard about him. He's heard about him in the region that he collects taxes. He's heard of the things he's done and said. And so he just wants to climb up in this tree and see Jesus. But Jesus doesn't miss this opportunity because Jesus never misses an opportunity. Look what happens in verse 5. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down. Now, if you write in your Bibles or in your phones, I want you to circle that word, hurry. It is one of the most encouraging words you will find in the New Testament. He says, sees him in this tree, and he could have just walked by. That's what we would have done, right? In that day, we see a guy in a tree, we'd have been like, oh, that's weird, right? And we would have went to the other side of the road, and we kept going. But Jesus, on his way, stops, sees him in the tree, the guy that no one talks to, the guy that everyone hates, and there's this giant crowd of people around. So much so that this man had to climb a tree. And of all the people that they thought Jesus might possibly stop and talk to, Zacchaeus was out of mind. It wasn't him, because he's not just a sinner, he's a tax collector. And yet Jesus stops in the road, looks up at Zacchaeus, and in front of the crowd tells him to hurry and come down. Now, you know how Zacchaeus feels in this moment. I'll tell you why you know. Because when you were a kid and your mom yelled across the house, hey, get in here right now. What did your heart feel like? You immediately, nobody in this room ever thought, I bet this is good news. I bet mom realizes what an awesome kid I am, and she's calling me into her room right now to pat me on the back, to sell. She may even have a gift for me, right? That's not what you thought. When your mom or dad said, hey, get in here right now, your heart sunk, didn't it? You immediately started thinking of all the bad things you've done. The ones they know and the ones they don't know, right? And the ones they don't know, you walk. It's the slowest walk of your life, isn't it? You're like, it's baby steps. It's like, I'm coming. And you don't really get going until you think of the excuse for whatever it is that you think you're in trouble for. That's Zacchaeus. He's sitting in this tree. He just wants to see Jesus. Jesus is walking down the road, stops. Hey, hurry up and get down here. And Zacchaeus' heart, I promise you, skipped a beat. Zacchaeus was like, oh, shoot. I wasn't expecting for this to happen. And so a nervous Zacchaeus climbs down, and everybody's watching this scene. They notice him getting out of this tree. But not only does Jesus tell him to get out of the tree, look, he tells him why. The end of verse 5, he says, because it is necessary for me to stay at your house. This might be my favorite part of this story, because let's all be clear. Let's go ahead and just rip the mask off here. You and I are Zacchaeus, right? This is all of us. We have a past. We have mistakes. We have sin. Like Zacchaeus, we have a history that we may not be proud of. Maybe that we haven't dealt with, we haven't moved beyond, that we've let define who we are. And usually we do that because we dwell on it. We think God is dwelling on it. In other words, right, we may be stuck in our past because we think God is stuck in our past. We don't take our past to God because we think He's as upset about it as we are. He's as angry about it as we are. He's as disappointed in us as we are. We feel shame and guilt because we think God looks at us and sees the sum of our sins and our mistakes and our bad choices. And so we never get past our past because we believe the lie of Satan that God hasn't gotten past our past. But part of Zacchaeus' story that's encouraging, that gives us hope, that gives you hope and me hope, is Jesus knows exactly who Zacchaeus is. He knows he doesn't look up and ask people, hey, who's this crazy guy in the tree, right? He knows who he is. He looks up. He knows where he lives. He knows everything about him. And here's why I love that word hurry so much, is because even though he knows everything about him, he says, hurry up and get down here so I can go spend time with you. He tells him to hurry. Jesus is excited to move past Zacchaeus' past. Like, don't miss that. Jesus could have looked up and known who he is and been like, man, that's trouble right there. and just kept going. But he looks up and he sees him and he says, hurry and get down here. I've got to go stay at your house today. Jesus is excited for Zacchaeus to be able to let go of his past. But how Zacchaeus responds to this invitation from Jesus matters, just like it matters how we respond. How we respond matters when it comes to our past. We have a choice to accept what Jesus wants to do. We have a choice to accept his forgiveness and give us a new identity. Or, like we often do, we can push his invitation for forgiveness away. We can push his willingness to give us a new identity away. And we can stay wrapped in our shame. And Zacchaeus had that choice to make. Look how he responds in verse 6. How did he get out of the tree? Quickly. He quickly came down, and how did he welcome him into his home? Joyfully. He welcomed him in joyfully. This is good. We're going to come back to this in a moment, but remember that line that he welcomed him joyfully. And then the crowd, remember there's a crowd there. This isn't happening in private. This is very, very public. And the crowd around this man that had all hated Jesus, they celebrate because this man has given his life to Jesus. It's not true at all. Actually, they get very mad. Look at verse 7. All who saw it began to what? Complain. He's gone to stay with a sinful man. Have you ever been around a group that's complaining about something? Like the more of them there are, the worse the complaining gets. So trust me, Zacchaeus knew what was happening in the crowd. He heard the whispers. He heard the rumbling. He knew they were talking about him in this moment. And this is important for us because listen to me. Some people want to keep you stuck in your past identity. But Jesus wants to give you a new identity. Some people try to keep you stuck in your past. They will constantly try to remind you of it. But Jesus is not stuck in your past. In Jesus, you are forgiven. You are made new. That's why later the Apostle Paul, writing to a church in Corinth, says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a what? He's a better version of his past self? He's some improved upon past? No, he's new. You're new. In Jesus, you are a new creation. The old has passed away and the new has come. I love this. Look, what Jesus is saying is that I'm going to stay with a sinner and I'm going to make him new. And the irony is, yes, Zacchaeus is a sinner. And yes, Jesus did want to spend time with him. But if the people around who were grumbling and complaining that day had had their way, if Jesus didn't go, if Jesus was never a guest of sinners, where would that leave all of them? Because let's think about Jesus. Jesus left heaven to come to earth where he was a guest for sure. And the only reason he came was to be a guest of sinners. That's it, which he points out later to them. And so he goes to Zacchaeus' house, and look what happens in verse 8. But Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, I'll give half of my possessions to the poor, Lord. And if I've extorted anything from anyone, I'll pay back 4 times as much. So they didn't want Jesus to go to his house. They were like, hey, this dude's a tax collector. He's too far gone. But what do you know? Jesus knew what he was doing. Jesus knew that a real and authentic relationship with him would lead to change. And it led to Zacchaeus dealing with his past. He repented. Now, he didn't just say, I'm sorry about what I've done, right? He said, I'm sorry, and my life will look different. I'm going to do different things. I'm going to stop ripping people off. And who knows how long Zacchaeus had carried this weight of dishonesty and rejection. Who knows how long he had walked through this heaviness of people hating him, of his own wrong decisions, that he knew he was stealing from people. And I'm sure that was weighing on him. I'm sure it was heavy on him. But he meets Jesus and he deals with his past. He says, I'm going to give back to anybody that I've stolen from 4 times. I'm going to stop doing this. And then look what Jesus says to him in verse 9. Jesus said to him, make certain that each day you remember your past. Repent again. Live out your days and die, because your past is where your identity remains. This is why you should have a Bible, because that's not a real verse. But that's what we would say, isn't it? Hey, I heard you say, I'm sorry, Zacchaeus, but I'm probably going to remind you of it next week. Zacchaeus, I've heard you say what you said, and I know you're going to do better, but man, you still have a lot of baggage, and I'm going to bring it up. That's what we would say, right? And we laugh at that, but that's how we often say to ourselves. Is I know I asked Jesus for forgiveness, but he can't use me. Man, my past is just too much. There's just too much history in my life. Like I love Jesus, but he doesn't have a plan for me. There's too much there. That couldn't actually be further from the truth. Look what he really says in verse 9. Jesus said to him, when? Today. Not tomorrow, not next week, not next month, not once you've proven that what you just said is true, not once you give the money back to people, not once you find a new career, not once you go to everybody you've wronged. He says, today, salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abram. That's it. He doesn't tell him, hey, you're going to be saved today, Zacchaeus, but you need to remember your past, okay? Zacchaeus, you're going to be saved, but make sure that when you meet new people, you tell them who you used to be. They need to know that there's some shady business in your history, okay? So they can make their own decision. He doesn't say any of those things. He doesn't even give him a list of things he's saved from. He doesn't talk about his past. He doesn't remind him of what he's being saved from and then tell him he's saved. He just says, you're saved. Why does he respond that way? Because God doesn't find your identity in your past. He finds your identity in Jesus. God doesn't really care about your past. He cares that you know Jesus. He's not come to drudge up your past and your history. He is there to give you a new identity in Jesus. So what does this mean for all of us? Well, on some level, you and I are Zacchaeus. All of us. We have a past. We're not perfect. But we have a hard time leaving our past. We have a hard time removing our identity from our past. From whatever that addiction was, whatever that poor relationship, how it ended, whatever that business failure is, that anger that we've wrestled with, that lust that we've struggled with, that jealousy that we have. We keep going back to it. We keep letting it define who we are and letting it determine what our tomorrow and our next week and our next month looks like. We keep checking to see if it's still there, and if it is, we cover it up. We just can't leave our past. And I think there's a couple reasons that we struggle with that so much. For some, it's because the crowd around you, like the crowd around Zacchaeus, is loud. And we keep hearing them talk. We keep hearing them remind us of our past. We keep seeing the whispers happen that constantly tell us we aren't good enough, that our past is who we are. But the truth is, how you deal with your past should not be dependent on the whispers of the crowd. How you deal with your past should not be dependent on the whispers of the crowd of people around you. If Zacchaeus had paid attention to the crowd, you know what he would have said to Jesus when Jesus said to come down from that tree? And everybody said, hey, that's a tax collector. Like, he's not a good guy. You know what Zacchaeus would have said if he had listened to the crowd? He would have said, Jesus, man, thank you for the offer, but they're right. Like, there's a lot more people in this crowd that are more worthy, that are more deserving of you to stop by. They got a better house. They got better food to serve. They don't have the past that I have. There's a lot more people here that you should stop by and see. That's what Zacchaeus would have said if he had listened to the crowd. But he didn't. And so he didn't miss Jesus being a guest in his house. And some of us need to stop paying attention to the crowd. If they obsessed over the past that you have dealt with, let them. Let them. But you moved beyond it through Jesus. Stop going back to it. But then there's another reason some of us don't deal with our past. It's not who you are paying attention to that keeps you from dealing with your past. It's who you're not paying attention to. Because the story really begins in verse 3 with Zacchaeus doing what all of us have to do if we're going to deal with our past. In verse 3, it says he was what? Trying to what? See who Jesus was. Zacchaeus was trying to see who Jesus was. He wanted to know who he really was. He knew about him. He had heard stories of him, but he wanted to see Jesus for himself. Zacchaeus knew about his past. He knew who he was. He knew what he had done. And because of that, because he understood his past, it created a desire in him to see Jesus. And sometimes we don't see who Jesus is because maybe we don't think we need to. Sometimes we don't have the desire to climb the tree and see Jesus as he passes by because we don't think our past is that bad. And there's a little bit, there's one skeleton in the closet. It's not full of skeletons. It's pretty good. If you grew up in the 80s or 90s before cell phones and you were going to travel somewhere, what did you have to do for directions? What did you have to print out? MapQuest, right? Y'all remember MapQuest, 19 pages to get to the town over, You had to live by the instructions, hey, when you see the tire swing, you're going to want to take a left. I know MapQuest says go right, but it's wrong, it hasn't been updated. You had to use those instructions, and inevitably you would be driving somewhere on page 3 of MapQuest, and it would be telling you this is where you're supposed to be. Or I remember my dad had the Rand McNally road atlas, for like the entire state. And some nights he would just sit on the couch and look, and I'm like, what are you trying to figure out about Montana? Like we're in Kentucky, and he'd plan trips and he'd have highlighted routes on there. And I remember him saying as we're sitting at intersections and he would have this giant map out, if you had extra money, you got the spiral bound so you could just roll the page back. If you didn't have that kind of cash on hand, you had to get the old school one, you just crease that bad boy. And he would point on the map and he would say something like this, we're supposed to be right here, and I remember looking at the map being like, how can you, this is the entire state. Well, how do you know where we're supposed to be looking at this thing? And you would get a little bit lost. I remember reading a story. I used to hike on the Appalachian Trail sometimes. I remember reading a story about a guy who went 120 feet off of the trail to use the bathroom, because that's polite etiquette if you're hiking, okay? Get off the trail. So he goes off about 120 feet, and he couldn't find the trail. And he had an emergency beacon, and so he hit the beacon. He thought he was lost forever in the woods in Georgia, and he hits the beacon, and search and rescue comes, and they're like, hey, dude, the trail's right there, this was a pretty expensive trip for us to come out here. The trail's right. But here's the thing about that. Being a little lost is still lost, right? You can be 100 feet off the trail, but if you don't know where the trail is, you're lost. It don't matter if you're 100 feet or 1,000 feet. A little lost is still lost, and it's the same with our past. A little sin, a little past, a little history is still sin. It's still a past. It's still a history, and all of us, whether we believe it or not, have a past. Which is why Jesus said at the end of this story, verse 10, for the Son of Man has come to seek and to save the who? The lost. He came to seek and to save the lost. Not the misplaced, not the almost found, not the misguided. He came for the lost, which was everyone in that crowd that day and everyone in this room this day. Because Jesus knows that we all have a past that only Jesus can free us from. It's when we act like Zacchaeus, when we see our past, when we see our need to look and see who Jesus is, that we will begin to change. Because all of us are Zacchaeus, and we have a history that separates us from God. But if we do what Zacchaeus did, Jesus will free us from a past that we can't free ourselves from. See, on this day, Zacchaeus changed. He had a new identity. He moved beyond his past because of Jesus. Not because he pushed it down or suppressed it or figured something else out. It's because of Jesus. That was what changed his life. And when we surrender our lives to Jesus, he will deal with our past too. Here's the secret to dealing with your past is you can't deal with it. You can't fix it. You can't go back and erase it. You can't go back and unsay it or undo it. Only Jesus can. Zacchaeus did not bootstrap himself into a new identity. He did not white knuckle his life and say, I'm going to work hard and I'm going to get this all together and then Jesus is going to save me. No, you know what changed? Zacchaeus invited Jesus to his house. That's what changed his life. That's what will change your life. When you invite Jesus to your life. The reality is we all have a past. Zacchaeus is not the only one that day carrying around a past. The whole crowd did. But Zacchaeus discovered the secret. Your past doesn't have to determine who you are. That's what makes Jesus so great. Every other religion, you study any other religion, they are going to say to you, get yourself together and then come to God. Figure it out, do better, ask for forgiveness more. Attend this, attend that. Maybe in your next life you'll get it right. Every other religion is going to say, when you've got it figured out at a high enough level, then you have reached the mountaintop and you can access God. And Jesus says, at your worst, hurry up because I want to go to your house today. At your lowest, at your worst place of sin in your life, the moment that would bring you the most shame, Jesus looks into the tree that you are in and says, hurry up and get down. It's necessary for me to come be with you today. Do you know why it's necessary? It wasn't for Jesus. They didn't change anything about Jesus. Jesus said, Zacchaeus, it's necessary for me to come to your house today. He says to you, it's necessary for me to come to your house today because Jesus knows that if he comes to your house, your life changes. Like he's not when I meet with people, I'm nervous sometimes. Like, man, I hope I say the right thing. I hope I do the right thing. I hope I teach them the right thing. Jesus wasn't nervous going into Zacchaeus' house. Jesus knew the power of Jesus. He said, Zacchaeus, hurry up. Let's get to your house. It's necessary, man. Of all the people in the crowd that Jesus would say that to, it's the worst of the worst, the lunatic in the tree. Jesus says, hurry up, man. I can't wait. It's necessary because your life is never going to be the same. If that doesn't give us hope, then nothing will. Don't pay attention to the ones pointing out our past. Pay attention to Jesus. Remember the line we read about Zacchaeus? He gladly welcomed Jesus into his home. It's because he knew that Jesus knew his past, and he knew that he could do something about it. That's why he climbed that tree. Even though Zacchaeus had a past, he welcomed Jesus into his home. Because Zacchaeus wanted a new identity, and he knew that he couldn't create that new identity. He knew he couldn't deal with his past. Only Jesus could. And he was ready to deal with it once and for all. And we need to do what Zacchaeus did. Stop letting our past define us. We need to let Jesus define who we are. We need to let Jesus define. Because Jesus is stronger than any past you have. He's greater than any sin. He's bigger than any struggles and problems you have. And listen to me. Jesus is willing and he is waiting. He is hurrying to redefine who you are if you will just let him. If you'll just climb the tree when he says, hey, let's do this, you say yes. If you will not try and free yourself from your past, but let Jesus do it, he will give you a new identity. And I promise you, the rest of Zacchaeus' life did not look anything like his history because he was made new when he let Jesus deal with his past. I'm going to invite Val up and Nick. They're going to play a song over us that I do want you to listen to the words to. But I'm going to give you a couple questions to think about as they are playing this song that just talks about Jesus' willingness to hurry to your house, his excitement, his desire to meet with you no matter what's in your past. Here's the questions I want you to think about as they play. What in your past do you need to let Jesus free you from? Maybe you're not a follower of Jesus and you need to give your life to him today. But maybe you are a follower of Jesus, but Satan's a deceiver. And if he can convince you that your past is still defining who you are, he's going to do it. So what is that thing that you need to let Jesus free you from? And then the second question is this, is have you ever accepted his complete forgiveness? Sometimes people don't surrender their life to Jesus because they just say, I'm too far gone. Like if Jesus knows all about me, he wouldn't want to save me. Can I tell you, if that's you, there is nothing more opposite of the truth. What did Jesus say? He came to seek and to save the lost. That is why he came. You and I are why he came. There is nothing in your history and your past that can separate you from the love of Christ. Paul tells us there is no depth, there is no action, there is no attitude, there is no sin that separates you from the love of Jesus. You just got to hurry out of the tree. It's necessary for Jesus to meet with you and give you a new identity. So I'm going to invite you to bow your heads and close your eyes as they sing this song over you. What in your past do you need to surrender to Jesus? And if you've never given your life to him, he is calling you this morning to hurry up out of the tree. It's necessary for him to meet with you.